Stefan Sagmeister, welcome to Design and Dialogue.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. It's a pleasure.
So just to repeat something Lucy just said, if you have questions for Stefan as we talk, put them in the chat. We'll get back to them at the end. Also, let us know where you're calling in from, if you don't mind. And Stefan, I guess I'm bound to ask this as my first question. How are you feeling? Are you happy?
I feel good. I think that if you see me squinting my eyes, it's not because there is so much light in here. It's because I'm actually just coming back from an eye doctor checkup, which went perfectly fine. But he, gave me some drops in my eye that enlarges my pupils, I guess. So if I'm a little squinting, it's not because of the incredible brightness of my life.
Or indeed the Zoom screen.
Exactly, yes, yeah.
Okay. There's probably some clever pun I could make there about you being a visionary, but I'm going to let that one go.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Just ask you, I assume you're calling from your home rather
Yes.
than the studio?
Yeah. I mean, well, it's basically, I'm upstairs of my home. There's just my current commute is literally going up a spiral staircase, and I have already since last summer a quite nicely equipped studio office upstairs. So I can open the doors here. There's a little there's a proper terrace attached to it. So it's an extremely comfortable place to work out of in these times. Yeah.
That's great. And how active has your studio been over the course of the year?
Well, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but already last August, basically we decided, or also I decided to literally limit my engagements in regular commercial design or communication design work, and really only create or work on projects that I find truly meaningful. So that also already meant that basically I was not by foresight, but by luck, very much ready for these times, because there was really like, I've already before worked exclusively with freelancers. Most of them before there was really no need for them to come to the studio. We could do that over Zoom beforehand. So from that point of view, nothing really changed all that much for myself.
It's interesting. I suppose I could say something similar, and I suppose that counts us among the fortunate, but also, as we'll talk about, you've done a great deal of introspection around the question of happiness and emotional centering. And it's great to hear that that's had some benefits for you during this time. What I would suggest, Stefan, is that we now turn to some images because we have so much to look at. And indeed, the first image that we'll look at is the exterior of this book, Things I Have Learned Over the Course of My Life, published in 2008. And we thought we would start with this, not because it goes back to the beginning of your career, because it doesn't, but indeed because it's a sort of compendium of thoughts, lessons, insights that you've gained. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this project and also about the way that you've used art and design practice as a way to track your own thought process.
Well, this project, like many of the projects that I still think of being worthwhile to have being done, came out of an idea that I had in my first sabbatical, or in one of the sabbaticals. Like, basically throughout my design career, I closed the studio every 7 years and did a year of sabbatical. And this really came out of thinking of doing the first one, where initially I had some thoughts about maybe moving more into a filmic direction. And then when that, after giving this some real thought and even some real planning, when I decided against that, I thought maybe I should use the professional, use the tools that I already know how to use, basically from communication designs, and see if I have something to say within that world. And during that year, I also kept a very tight diary because I had more time. I wrote longer passages more frequently. And one of the passages that I had wrote down, but among hundreds, was a list of things that I believe to be true, basically things that I've learned so far. And when the studio was open again after that year, in the very beginning of the studio, we got 2 jobs in that basically we could basically do whatever we wanted. The first one was a series of billboards for France, and the second one was dividing pages for a magazine also in Europe. And it was surprisingly difficult for me to basically answer that brief to do whatever I wanted. And which I normally don't do, I procrastinated until the very last second of what it could possibly would be to put on these billboards when I could do whatever. And then literally last second, the idea came about, well, I just take one of these things off the list and make a graphic sentence out of it, which for the billboards turned out to be everything I do always comes back to me. And we basically designed this as well as we could and put it on billboards in France. And there was, surprisingly to me, I have to admit, a lot of great feedback from that. Like, you know, designers wrote in, people wanted to have photos of it or prints. There was a lot of feedback within the design world, as in it got featured a lot in magazines, even in non-design publications. So then I thought, well, I'll do more of this. And ultimately, this whole list, which then turned out, I think, into ultimately in about 35 distinct points, were then collected in this book.
And then you visualized each of them. We'll just go through some of them here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This also gives a good sense of the range of your visual language. Yeah. And so to me, they almost seem like rebuses in some ways, or puzzles to decode as well, which I suppose I find interesting because you are offering wisdom, and there's an ancient tradition of offering wisdom in the form of a riddle. So there's also a sense that, you know, an image like this one, which is so striking, could be interpreted in so many different ways. And I wonder if you would talk about the use of photography and design language as a way of getting across this idea of what you've learned.
See, I mean, I always felt that in this case, the messages were very straightforward. I meant them exactly how they were written. They were not ironic, or they were not cynical. In this case, it's the first image of a whole sentence that says, drugs are fun in the beginning, but become a drag later on. I really believe that. That's what I had experienced and in fact learned. And in this case, the photographic translation of this image really came through a German artist, through Martin Kippenberger, who basically at one time had done a show with various images that he had painted. That show I had never seen, but a show that I had seen from Kippenberger was where he had explained, where he stood at the entrance of his own exhibition, and a 10-year-old boy came by, left the exhibition. Kippenberger asked him what he had seen, and the boy basically told Kippenberger, and Kippenberger took notes. And one of the things that the boy told Kippenberger what he had seen was he had seen a snail going over a razor blade. And then Kippenberger he had asked him to write it down. And then Kippenberger took the writings of this boy and made white on white paintings out of that. And those paintings I had seen and basically translated them back with the help of the photographer Bela Borsody into images without having ever seen the first one. So it's basically one of those, I don't know, Chinese whispers kind of ideas where things get translated and retranslated.
Yeah. So it's a really good example of your conversational process, the associative chain that's often present in your work. Maybe you could just briefly explain each of these as we pass by them.
This was helping others helps me. These were light boxes installed in Europe first commissioned by a charity, really, who was, in the business of helping. And that also was something that I felt that basically, ultimately, nothing that I do to help somebody else is really 100% altruistic. There is always something in it for myself. And I'm fine with that, meaning I wouldn't be fine with that if my own advantage is ultimately bigger than the advantage to the person that's being helped. But I think that there is no pure altruism. That's really how that came about.
Yeah, almost a flip side of the idea on the poster that everything I do comes back to me also.
Yes. Yeah. And these are basically the other pieces of photography that's still from that Kippenberger series. Drugs are fun in the beginning, but become a drag later on.
See another one here.
In the beginning, exactly. Yeah.
This is also brilliant, though, because of the way that you're playing, on the one hand, on the language of surrealism, but also on something that graphic designers do all the time, which is make things like newspapers. And I find it fascinating the way that you are embedding graphics and also this referentiality. We can see here a snail crawls over a razor blade, and then the cello, which we're about to see. So it's this, again, this kind of densely packed rebus-like image.
And I think that was done very, very much on purpose. You see, like as a communication designer, usually, like, you do a promotion for something. The goal is always to communicate as clear, precise, and maybe fast as possible. And I think in these pieces, we had the freedom and the luxury and the wonderfulness to, on one hand, be clear. I think the sentence is very clear. But at the same time, really invite also some ambiguity and some possibility for other people to interpret various images. And I think that any image that wants to have some longevity basically needs that ambiguity. If it's like, for example, any image that I would want to hang into my living room, I would want some ambiguity, some possibilities that even maybe my own interpretation of it might change over time. It just makes it a richer experience.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one of the reasons why you constantly move back and forth between graphics and these other domains, because there's a precision, but there's also a kind of open-endedness, a kind of radical instability.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Would you like to talk about this phrase as well?
I think that's, basically, it's again an image that's from a bigger sentence. Can you maybe go to the next one?
Sure.
So they're a little bit mixed up. So this become a drag is still from the drugs are fun in the beginning, but become a drag later on. And then maybe go to the next one.
I think the next one is actually a different project.
Okay. But basically, meaning all, this was part of a series that we all photographed in Arizona with another set of limitations where we said, we basically will go out in the morning into the desert, or in this case, it was the house that we stayed in, and shoot one image per day. This was, I think that's, you know what, I'm blanking a little bit over the entire sentence here, but this was definitely created. It was one of the very early very early images being created. I think maybe we'll switch over to the AIGA poster that you saw.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe just last thing to say though here is that it also this series also dramatically shows how you physicalize text, which is one of the really key features of your work. And indeed, that is certainly true here as well in an unmistakable way. So this is a famous poster that you made in 1999, I believe, when you did an AIGA lecture at Cranbrook, the great
exactly,
Detroit. So I know you must have been asked to speak about this a million times. but it is very raw. It's very punk, you could say, perhaps. It makes me think of the Viennese action school too, which of course you're big.
Meaning that was a big influence, not a conscious one, I have to say, at the time. But when I think 2 years later, I went back to Vienna and I saw an exhibition in the museums district on the Viennese actions. And of course, it all came back that, of course, that was an influence, but it wasn't really unconscious influence at the time. Mm-hmm. I think in those years, as you might recall, one of the big buzzwords in design was really a process. And I was long an admirer of that Pink Floyd Animals cover that Storm Thorgerson had designed with that flying inflatable pig over the Battersea Power Station, and the whole story that cover had created, because, you know, the band had insisted that the pig was done for real, was for real. It wasn't just photomontaged into the shot. And the pig got away and landed on landed somewhere in Wales on a freaked out farmer's farm, and created a lot of news and stories in the UK. And I was always thought that the Pink Floyd Animal cover somehow, apart from being formally fantastic, also was imbued with the story of its creation. And I kind of tried to make a story about process, or make a poster where the target audience, since it's a design lecture, which would be designers, that the target audience could immediately tell how this poster has been made. And if you saw that poster in real life, we had shot it with a very large format film camera, meaning not digital, of course, at the time. And so there was an incredible amount of detail being visible. You saw every single pore of my skin. And you could also immediately tell that this type was really cut into my skin with an X-Acto knife, that it wasn't photoshopped. In fact, it probably would have been even more painful if we would have had to Photoshop all that type at the time, because like every pore was visible. And it was much more painful than I had expected it to be. There was definitely times throughout the process it took much longer. I had planned for 2 hours for cutting, and I think it took 8 hours for cutting, simply because it was just too painful. And I definitely thought about giving up, but then I didn't have another idea, and the deadline for the poster was through. So basically it seemed the easier way to basically, go through with it. Luckily, I do have a relatively, well, actually I have not relatively, I have very, very good skin. I have very quick healing skin. So 3 or 4 months later after this poster, there was really nothing visible anymore.
Yeah. It's interesting how it marks the moment, right? Because it's about an event. So that mirroring is fascinating. I suppose we should credit the photographer, who is Tom Shirlitz, because it's
Tom Shirlitz, yeah, absolutely, very much so. Yeah, and I think that this was also done on purpose, that it was that the photo was somehow a bit theatrical and done in a aesthetic way to sort of like offset the fairly brutal wounds of the cutting.
Yeah. Let me ask you about one other thing, which is that style equals fart slogan, which is prominently placed right below the bandage. That's something I gather you also had on your studio door.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that meant to you then and what it means now to you.
Yeah, well, it was, this was, I think was on the studio wall in the opening in '93. And I felt at the time that it really is all about concepts, and that stylistic considerations are really hot air and quite meaningless. And of course, as I went along and got more experience and also thought more about this issue, I really discovered, I did a complete 180 on this question. I actually now believe that stylistic considerations are not hot air at all, that they are actually can influence the quality and the direction of a project significantly, and that they have a huge impact on how a project is received and how strongly the message can cut through something. So I really, I think I was wrong. I literally think I was completely wrong, and I now believe that style and form have an enormous impact on how we communicate and how this communication is received.
Would you be prepared to accept the idea that when you were first starting out, there was a kind of youthful rawness and a desire to overthrow standard norms, and then you simply matured into a...
For sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And of course, I ultimately, you know, grew up in an age, or my formative years were definitely in an age where, you know, I would say that within the art world, conceptualism was reigning, and within the design world, you know, the big idea was sort of the thing that everybody adhered to, and that was, you know, and however form that big idea took, or in the art world, however the concept was basically best shown in its immediate and rawest form. That was sort of like the idea. Yeah.
Just going to move to this next project, Sagmeister on a Binge, which I suppose is a sort of pendant. So here the idea is that you put on weight, 25 pounds.
Yeah.
So 178 pounds at the top, 203 at the bottom. And
all done within a week.
Yeah. So this kind of hilarious embrace of consumer culture, I suppose.
Yeah.
There's again here a kind of putting your body into the equation and a sort of ultra realism that I would definitely associate with the IAGA poster.
Yeah. No, I think that they came pretty close on top of each other. This is probably, I'm not 100% sure, but here
2003.
Okay. Yeah. So no, I think that there is definitely a connection between those. There's no doubt about it. This one, of course, was for a couple of shows, one in Tokyo and one in Osaka. I felt that considering these exhibitions were, you know, fairly personal, or the same was true for the AIGA talk, there was a fine reason for the use of myself, of my own image on the poster made a lot of sense. It was sort of akin to, I don't know, making a beer ad and having a beer can in the beer ad, like the packaging shot kind of thing.
Yeah. So again, a kind of play on some of the standard genres of graphic design.
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you just said about conceptual art, because this also reminds me a lot of conceptual art, including a famous project by Eleanor Antin called Carving, where she actually lost weight, which is more of a feminist gesture. But it's kind of performance art that you're engaging in here.
Yeah, I'm actually unfamiliar with that project, but there is one by an Austrian artist, by Erwin Wurm, where he puts on a fat suit that goes a little bit in direction. So, meaning I still see this, of course, as I do all of our work, firmly rooted in the world of design. And so from that point of view, sometimes they're, you know, quite different in outcome.
Yeah, okay. That leads us naturally to this image, which was inspired by the work of Sharon Nishat, another great contemporary artist, at least in part, but also affords us an opportunity to talk about your very powerful collaborations with the music industry. So here, Lou Reed, another name that everyone will know is David Byrne, who you've also collaborated with a lot. Can you talk a little bit about what those alliances have done for you in your career and why it's been so important for you to work in music?
Well, it's when I really opened the studio in 1993. So this is, you know, whatever that is, that's 27 years ago. we literally, it had a subtitle that said design for the music industry, because I felt I want to have a small studio and we want to work for musicians combining the two loves of my life, music and design. It just made a whole bunch of sense. It took a while to really break in there, you know, created a number of projects for friends in bands. And then Lou was really sort of like the first well-known name that came to the studio. It also turned out that he was actually a neighbor. Lou lived on 11th Street, I'm on 14th Street. So that also helped. So it was easy to visit each other. And we wound up doing a lot of work for Lou. We did a lyric book for him, a number of albums, this poster, of course, but you know, a good number of other projects. And I would say that probably him and David Byrne, we definitely became, you know, maybe not the closest of friends, but definitely very friendly, like, you know, saw each other also in other occasions when it wasn't about just, you know, the project at hand. We, you know, wound up in those early years of the studio doing a lot of these things. You know, we did album covers for the Stones and Aerosmith, and then later on for Jay-Z, and you know, a whole bunch of people. And I had always loved the process, because ultimately you're picking something that's extremely emotional, music, in this case rock music, and you are packaging it, still trying to keep that emotion or maybe visualize that emotion from the music, but it doesn't start, there is no images to start out with. So from that point of view, I always was much more attracted to, let's say, album covers than I would have been to film posters, which is a totally different process, because if you do a film poster, you're basically creating something that's already inherently visual, the film, and you're distilling it down into a single still image, which is just a much less interesting process than to come up with a new image that comes out of the emotionality of something that's ultimately non-visual. So yeah, no, I thought that the process was fantastic, but then in that first sabbatical, after the first 7 years, I thought that there was so much other interesting things out there that it would be, you know, just more juicy to move in new directions, and then left the music world largely alone.
Okay. Before we move on from this image, I did want to ask you if you might compare it to the IAGA poster, because we have text on bodies in both cases. And I wonder what your thoughts are on these two very key images in your career and how they relate to one another.
I mean, there is some formal similarities, you know, mainly that both of them contain my handwriting, and both of them are somehow type on bodies. The process, of course, couldn't be more different. This is, you know, an overlay, you know, this is ink on an overlay, while the other one is an X-Acto knife directly on the body. And I think that ultimately there's probably there's some similarity about the personalness of typography. That, of course, these are the lyrics to Lou Reed's song "Set the Twilight Reeling," which really was about him falling in love with Laurie Anderson. Like, that whole album was about that, and it was also a much more, I think, positive take coming out of Lou, who's been before, you know, known much more as the dark prince of maybe rock music. So it's, I think, yes, there are similarities, but then there are significant differences, I would say.
Yeah, okay. Just briefly, I just wanted to show this poster because it's so very strong. This is, in fact, cow tongues, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, rather than a digitally manipulated image. It's important to say that. And here again, we see you in a way being extremely literal. So dialogue tongues. Yeah. And yet there's also kind of amazing playfulness, for example, in the way that you've used the F and the E and freshen dialogue to suggest brackets. So there's a lot of gamesmanship in this image as well. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about your process of conceiving and delivering an image like this.
Well, this one was actually influenced by a poster I had done at school at the University for Applied Arts in Vienna, which definitely worked with tongues, but in this, I think in the school version of it, it was illustrated tongues. And then when this poster came up, I had this thought, well, the old school work came to mind, but I also thought this could be significantly enhanced by photographic, very detailed tongues. Again, the photos were done by Tom Schierlitz, same photographer, than the cutting poster. And it actually was rejected at the time by the head of the AIGA. And when I insisted, like he basically thought, oh, design something different, we can't do this. And I said, no, I'm not going to design something different. And when I asked why we can't do this, he said, well, I'm sure that the other speakers, because it wasn't just my talk, that the other speakers would mind. And I said, well, let's figure this out. Let's call up Lisa Cronin, let's call up IO360 and see what they have to say about the poster. And when we did, it turned out to his big disappointment that both Lisa Cronin and IO360 actually loved the poster. So then there was no more argument and they had to go ahead and print it.
Yeah. Can I just ask you also a question about masculinity? Because of course, I can imagine one reason he was worried was not so much that they were cow tongues, but that they were such phallic shapes. And I wonder what your thoughts on that are, particularly now that there is such a critique of masculinity. You know, this obviously long predates the Me Too movement, and the whole cultural context is different, but it's something that you have played on and thought about a lot. The question of your own, what I might even say your gendered identity, has been very forefronted in your work in a way that I think actually a lot of male designers and artists tend to suppress and not address. And I wonder if you would talk about that a little bit.
I mean, I think that ultimately that probably was also on the head of the AIGA's mind. And I think that when Lisa Krohn totally embraced it and basically, like, I remember her almost screaming into the phone, I love this thing. It, you know, took that aside. And I would say that in this case, yes, absolutely. I mean, very obviously these things are phallic, but they're also kind of disgusting. So I think that in the work, when in our work, or in my work specifically, this early work that really is, you know, about overt masculinity, it's never in a straightforward way. I mean, this is sort of, I think it promotes it and it questions it at the same time, I would say.
Yeah.
You know, and meaning there was an opening card for the studio that, you know, the original opening card that shows me with a small and with a large penis. But, you know, I sort of extend there with black socks on in an extremely non-sexy way and it's clearly, it's masculine, but it's also ironic and sort of joking about the own masculinity. So I think it's a bit more, I would say both of those images lie somewhere in between promoting and critiquing this whole issue.
An element of satire for sure. Yeah. Let's look at this, something completely different. This is a project that you did at Deitch Projects. And I'm just going to flick through it, and perhaps you could explain the premise as people see these images go by. So we should first say it says self-confidence produces fine results.
So this is still basically ultimately this was one of the sentences of that list of things I've learned in my life so far. I meant it very much like all of them, in a very straightforward way, as in that I felt that in basically my self-confidence comes and goes in waves. Like there's weeks that I'm super self-confident and weeks when I'm much less so. And I've noticed that in the weeks when I'm self-confident, I am of more use to other people, meaning that other people can get more out of it. I'm more out of me. I'm more helpful. I'm more productive. It's somehow, I felt that in periods when I'm self-confident, I'm a better citizen for the world, or I'm better for my surroundings. And so we installed this at Deitch on Grand Street in Soho in New York with 6,500 bananas. We did a year's worth of banana testing in the studio beforehand we knew a lot about the ripening patterns of bananas by then. And in the 5 weeks of the exhibition that it was on at Deitch in February, those bananas riped. And if you go back a little bit, in the very beginning, you can of course see the typography. Then a week later, that type was basically erased by the green bananas going yellow. And then a week later, and another week later, and another week later, you can sort of see the self-confidence coming back a little bit, but not quite. And that really was the desire to basically show that thing, how it comes in waves and back and forward. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fantastic project, partly because it is so funny, and even the banana is like an icon of slapstick, like slipping on the banana peel. But I also love the way that it seems to also be about itself, like the self-confidence of sticking 6,500 bananas on the wall and just knowing that this is going to work. And then
there were a lot of connotations in there. Definitely the slapstick, definitely the famous Lou Reed banana that Warhol designed, that for the Velvet Underground, that we of course had a connection again, I know that this whole project came up again now when the Maurizio Catalan banana got so famous, but it's of course, I think that it's just a particularly aesthetic piece of fruit that lends itself to being used in design, or as we've seen in art, extremely well.
Okay, well, let's appreciate the banana.
And then, of course, I could, of course, go on talking forever about the Warhol banana, which, meaning Andy's place within that world of art and design in the 20th century is so particularly unique, considering he started as a commercial illustrator, was incredibly successful as a commercial illustrator, won New York Art Directors Gold medals for his illustration, then made a conscious switch over into the art world. But even after he made that switch, I would say, if you've seen the Warhol exhibition a year or two ago at the Whitney, where they showed the whole oeuvre, I would say that even after he made the switch, some of his very, very best work was actually graphic design. Like, the album cover for the Velvet Underground, the album cover for the Stones, like Sticky Fingers. These were in the context of his work in the exhibition, among the very, very best pieces that he had done in his life. And it's just interesting that now he's just celebrated as an artist, even though he very clearly, even then, and that I think the Whitney exhibition acknowledges that, that some of the art projects that he did at the time, like, painting wives of German industrialists for money that he then spent on his graphic design project on Interview magazine. Like, he probably was among the very few people who used the proceeds from his fine artwork to push his graphic design projects that he clearly favored over what he did in the art world. So it's this gigantic mix of back and forwards between the art and the design worlds.
It's great to hear you talk about him too, because of course pop is a big part of the DNA of your work as well. So it's really great to hear you speak about Warhol. Let's though turn our attention to this project, which is called the Darwin Chair. And this
Yeah.
is another good example of cross-disciplinarity, because this is essentially graphic design become furniture design.
Yeah.
So we have 3
So,
images of this.
created this in during the second sabbatical. This was in Indonesia. Was designed originally as a prototype. Then this, I think, what you see here is the second prototype. The first prototype actually just got bought, like literally a month ago, by the museum in Philadelphia, by the Museum of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, which I was super happy with. And I think that they're planning on putting it on display in the next like year or so. So it's very happy about this. It's called the Darwin Chair because it goes through an entire evolution. Like it basically, I think that the top layers, the top sheets start with the Big Bang, and then it basically goes through. It's, you know, all these sheets are perforated. So basically the chair changes its appearance, its surface appearance from, well, however often you want to change that. That's pretty much it. And it's all different graphics printed on Tyvek. So it actually is fairly long lasting. Like, you know, the one sheet can be set upon fairly extensively before you would have to rip it off.
I find it interesting in relation to the Bananas project, because it's another thing about sequence and temporality being built into the design too. And then one more book project. This is Hot to Cold, which was a collaboration with Bjarke Ingels, BIG, a great architecture firm. And this is it's actually a project about climate in a lot of ways, as well as being about architecture.
It was a very easy project. I mean, basically this was Bjarke and I getting together in a couple of meetings in his studio and looking for ways to order the entire output, which at that point was already extremely significant, of their studio, and finding a way of how to make a book publication that could also work as an exhibition that they were planning at the same time at a museum in Washington, D.C. And as we discussed this idea came up, and I think it came from Bjarke, that rather than, you know, meaning that obviously there's plenty of historic possibilities on how to order your project. You know, when Kohlhaas did it famously from, you know, extra small to extra large, but you could normally probably would be by a timeline, you know, or I mean, there's many possibilities. And I think it was Bjarke who came up with the idea to order the projects by climate, by basically where they are located from hot to cold. And that idea pretty much then designed the book. You know, of course we could, you know, can create these frames from hot colors to cold colors. And that also was then true for the exhibition itself in Washington. And they could reuse, basically, there was an impetus that the layouts that we would do for the book could also be reused one-to-one for the exhibition. It was a very easy project because we basically just had to design 10 or 15 spreads, like, you know, sort of like have a declination of all possibilities. And then the hard and heavy lifting was really done at Big itself, where all the details was run into that grid that we had created for them.
Okay. Well, speaking of exhibition making, let's now move to the big topic of the Happy Show. Very successful, really international project because it toured around as well. And this gets us into a part of the interview where we're talking about happiness as a great subject that you've taken on. So maybe what I'll do here is just show a few images. And then would it be okay if we look at the video first, and then you could speak a little bit about the, okay. So we're just going to play this video with the sound.
And I can probably comment on the videos. You know, the text clearly says, if I don't ask, I won't get. And that's, I think, the only one out of all of these sentences that I didn't really write myself. It was a comment by a now friend of mine, by Richard Saul Wurman, the original founder of TED, who basically said that that is one of his two mottos that he himself had learned in life. And I found it so interesting, but also so true for myself, that I put that part in the series. But of course, we really shot it for the Happy Show. That was one of the advantages of having a traveling show, that ultimately it was shown in 10 different museums around the world. And some of those museums still had a little budget extra, so we could create something additional, something special for that museum. So as the show traveled along, it got bigger and bigger because it picked up a couple of new pieces here and there, which was also, as it turned out, a wonderful way of designing a show, because when it started in Philadelphia, it was still overseeable. Maybe, I don't know, like in Philadelphia, it probably was 3,000 square feet. Or maybe 4,000 square feet, while at the end it was easily 10 or maybe 15,000 square feet. But so we didn't have to create this giant show in one piece. This is, you know, a bicycle that if you if you worked very hard on this stationary bike, you made the electricity that made that neon sign light up in front of you, you know, and it said, actually doing the things I set out to do increases my overall level of satisfaction. And then when you kept on going, there was sort of like a bonus level that said, seek discomfort. So ultimately, it was like the Happy Show was a continuation, or it started out really, the whole thing started out as a lecture where I had the idea of just basically, instead of showing our design work straight on, I called the lecture Design and Happiness, and ordered the way all of our work accordingly of if I thought it made us in the studio happy, or if I thought it had the possibility to make the viewers who saw that work happy. And that lecture just got an incredible amount of positive feedback. And out of that, also again during the second sabbatical, when I looked for a project to work on, it seemed that the subject was probably worthwhile to really explore deeper. And then it started with the idea for the happy film. And while we were working on the happy film, we got offered this possibility to do an exhibition in Philadelphia. And when we said, they wanted us to do a regular graphics exhibition. And I thought, I'm not so interested in that, but if we could do an exhibition on happiness, that would be a lovely subject. And you see here an installation made out of little cigarette papers placed on the wall with fans in front of them, so they're all wiggling, and it just says uselessness is gorgeous. This was for Chicago, something we made for Chicago that was put on, and maybe go on one more.
I think that gets us to the happy film.
That gets us to the happy film. So the exhibition was big. It included many interactive pieces, like I remember pieces of typography made out of sugar cubes that had a projection on them, and the sugar cubes incorporated a hidden camera that could tell if the visitor was smiling or not. And when the visitor was smiling, the sugar cubes turned colorful in the projection, and the person wasn't smiling, it remained black and white. So there was a lot of stuff that you could kind of play with, but then there was also a lot of information on happiness in general, and on a lot of information on my own experience of what would make me happy and what wouldn't. And considering this started 10 or 12 years ago, I think, it really caught the imagination of the audiences. I mean, ultimately, I think we've had over 500,000 people visiting these shows, which I actually talked to Stephen Heller about this, who probably is the foremost design historian when it comes to graphics for sure, worldwide. And he thought that this might actually be a record, that he was not aware of any design show who would attract those kind of numbers. Yeah. So, and that of course, I'm extremely aware that had a lot to do with, I think, the possibility of audiences relating their own lives to this content.
And this very elusive concept of happiness that we all think we want, but it's very difficult to define, difficult to find. Yeah. And Stefan, you mentioned just a moment ago that there's also this pivot between exploring happiness in general and what might make other people happy, and also what makes you yourself happy. And that then became the great subject of this project, the Happy Film, which I was delighted to see one reviewer described as stressfully contemplative, which I think captures it perfectly. We have another video here, which I'll just play silently. This is just a kind of trailer for it.
I think it's what we're looking at here right now is just the title sequence shot in Bali, still with the pig, using the pig of a neighbor. I think you pointed it out that initially the Happy Film was supposed to be a general film about happiness. And we started out, like many other films about happiness, interviewing experts. And it seemed that this turned out almost into an impossible project, because I was not really an expert myself. I'm not a psychologist. I also saw a series by one of the experts that I admired a lot, by a Harvard professor who had done a series on happiness for Channel 13. And even though that Harvard professor was, I very much thought he was one of the smarter experts and an extremely good speaker and very outspoken, I thought what he came up with was for Channel 13 was more mediocre than I had hoped for. And I thought, if he can't even pull this off, why do I expect as a graphic designer to be able to pull this off? And then we pivoted and made it really about my own happiness. which of course then necessitated this to become a very, very personal film, which yielded a whole slew of its own problems, of course.
Yeah. Well, if people haven't had a chance to see it, I heartily recommend it to you. It tells you a lot about Stefan as well as a lot about happiness. We're actually running a little low on time, Stefan, so I'm going to move us quickly through our next subject, which is the beauty exhibition that you did. Well, I saw it in Vienna at the Museum für Angewandte Kunst in Vienna, but again, it was a multi-venue show. I thought it was particularly interesting there in Vienna because of the legacy of Jugendstil and the secession movement and the idea of art for art's sake. But can you talk a little bit about why you were interested in taking on beauty as a topic?
Mainly because it's been such a subject non grata within the design world. I mean, definitely when I studied in Vienna, there was no talk about beauty at all. And still, I think that there are people in my field in communication design who really see themselves as problem solvers and don't see any connection of their profession to aesthetics whatsoever. And I think that that's still wildly spread in architecture out of some completely misunderstood idea of modernism. Like, you know, if you look at the giants of modernism, they took form incredibly seriously. Like, you know, Adolf Loos ultimately was a huge aesthete, not just with what he did, but even like for his own dress code. I mean, he wrote the book on how to dress. And I think this, specifically in the second part of the 20th century, many designers, many architects misunderstood the big achievements of modernism and pressed it into the world of this, I would say, economic functionalism. That still has a root, and we still see that rearing its incredibly ugly head all the way until today. And we basically felt there was a real need to fight this. And so that we felt that not a lot of other people are doing this. So let's do this. And I think it felt at the time, like it felt meaningful to do. And of course, in the meantime, we've seen either influenced or maybe just a little underlined. There was just a big conference in Europe, an architectural conference on beauty. You have, I think, the very top tier of architects. You know, like there's a big talk by Renzo Piano on beauty. There is, I think that Jacques Herzog from Herzog and de Meuron talks openly about beauty again. So I think that the extreme top level of architects is again seeing that aesthetics really do play a significant role in what we do. But I think for an audience, much, much, much more important than the discussion within the professions is that we can show and prove that beauty not only influences how we feel, but it also influences how the way we behave. And it's meaning, I think that one argument that I can quickly mention to you and then we move on is the number one word in Google Translate from the 10 major languages of the world into English and from English into the 10 major languages of the world, the number one word is beautiful. So the fact that you still have designers out there who think that this is somehow not important is just, I can only call it idiotic. How can something that is the first on everybody's mind when they need to translate something, not be important for our profession?
That triggers so many thoughts about why that might be and the scenarios that might involve wanting to know what that word is in French. But I'm bound to ask you just one, if you can answer this quickly, I'd be super grateful. But having looked at happiness and beauty, do you see a correlation between them? Do they ultimately seem like the same thing in some way?
Well, I think there's definitely a big overlap. I don't think that they're the same at all, but there is an overlap. There is, I know that if you go back as far as Plato or as little as the 19th century, but Plato definitely thought that beauty was somehow a moral value, up there somewhere with goodness. Like if it was good, it was beautiful. If it was beautiful, it was good, like from a moral standpoint. And so, of course, goodness would have something to do, would be somewhat connected to how we feel and happiness. So I think that there is definitely an overlap there. I would say, if I can do a quick example, if you look at how people feel and behave in Grand Central versus how they feel and behave in Penn Station.
Yes.
You can feel the mood in those spaces, same function, same kind of audience, immediately. You can also can measure it scientifically that people feel much worse in Penn Station than they do in Grand Central. So there is a difference in mood and therefore a difference in happiness created by the architectural atmosphere of those spaces.
This is such a great example, because if you ever wanted to demonstrate the significance of design, anybody who's experienced those two buildings would immediately see the point. Well, let's, again, I'm going to turn the volume down on this. Let's just look at one last video and talk a little bit about what you've been up to most recently, Stefan. What's been occupying you?
So basically, I've been influenced by a couple of scientists, one at Harvard, one from Sweden, who've done significant work in the past 2 decades about long-term thinking. Like basically, they've been looking at data of various human endeavors and discovered that if you look at it from a very long perspective, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, depending on where the data is available, almost any aspect that is important for human beings is developing in a positive way. And now you could say, well, but then we would have to agree on that, on what aspects they would be, but there are some very basic ones. I think that most of us would agree that life is better than death. Most of us would agree that being satisfied with our drink and food is better than experiencing hunger. Most would agree that peace is better than war. Most would agree that being healthy is better than being sick. And all of these things, but many others too, actually can be and have been measured, and all of them we got better, meaning very obviously we live far longer, we are much healthier than any generation before us, we experience much less hunger, like extreme poverty worldwide has gone down extremely, and most of it in the past 30 years. And all of this information is easy to forget because our media has become shorter and shorter and shorter in its publishing cycle. And the shorter the publishing cycle, the more negative the media is. This basically is by definition. So basically, if we listen to Twitter or cable news, that information is completely obliterated by the short-term scandals or catastrophes that we experience, because of course it is somehow the job of serious journalism, or definitely that's how serious journalists see that job, to basically tell us about everything that's going wrong within the world, and completely then ignoring all the many things that go slightly right in the world. And most positive developments go up very, very, very slowly, which doesn't really go well for the news. I mean, there is a scientist who points out that the headline, 300,000 people got out of extreme poverty today, could have been run truthfully for the past 20 years, but of course it hasn't been. So ultimately, what I'm trying to do is to create images that remind us that if we look at the world from a long-term perspective, let's say 100 years or 200 years, that not all things look that badly. And if you go back one image, sure. Basically, I grew up with all these 19th century, sometimes 18th century images because my great-granddad had an antique store. So with the rest of those antique stores, I grew up with, they hung in our hallways. But if I look at my great-grandmother, Rosalia, she actually was the first woman in Austria who was allowed to vote. This was, in 1919. And it turns out that this was basically, she was there exactly, or very close to every other woman around the world. So in this case, we inserted these new round canvases into the old canvas, cut the old canvas out. So the yellow dot is female voting rights in 1900, the pink one in 1950, and the big purple one that is now basically every democratic country in the world has, of course, female voting rights. And if you see it, the second image, it's just more of an example of it sometimes is worthwhile to look at things from a longer perspective. This is really 200 years, and it looks at global warming, and it looks at who put which continent, or which culture put up how much CO2 in the air cumulatively. So over the entire period of the past 200 years. And I always thought that the biggest criminals when it comes to putting CO2 up into the air would be China and the US. But if you look at it from a long-term perspective, China really just is the little yellow dot. The US is the light blue rectangle, and the big red shape is Europe, because of course they've been doing this throughout all the industrial revolution through the entire time. And I'm doing other things in that, basically other things in that direction. This is an image of how suicide remained steady in the United States over the past 100 years. So if you are in depression, under the impression that things are getting worse there, you're wrong. Basically, it's been extremely steady over the past 100 years, but I'm also doing basically things that would live in a household. So these are things that we would hang on a wall, but I just completed, and I think they're coming out in November, a set of espresso cups for Illy, for the coffee company. I'm doing something on a blanket. So it's basically an ongoing project that all ultimately, I call it beautiful numbers. So that little reminders that while my daily Twitter feed might look like that the world is going to end tomorrow, if you step back, things are not that bad.
Yeah, yeah. It's a fantastic collision of graphic design or data visualization and fine art as well. So it's a great conclusion to our talk. It also incidentally reminds me a little bit of the work of John Baldessari, which is right behind your head, I think.
Absolutely, yes. With the dots, there is definitely, without any doubt, let me go ahead here, a Mr. Baldessari influence there, specifically in the first one with in the woman, yeah.
Let me, we are just a little over time, so I'll just ask you one question, which comes from our own Alex Gilbert. And she asked this earlier on when we were talking about the style equals fart, but yeah. She asks, is there anything else that you've dramatically changed your mind on over the years?
Interesting. Well, I would say maybe not dramatically changed my mind up, but I think that I'm now, I would say politically, I got to be much more central. I would say that when I was young, I mean, I think that my first design job at 15 was at a very left-wing magazine that that I don't, meaning it was not the radical left, but it was definitely very much on the left within Austria or so. And I find myself now within these elections, I'm meaning very much in the middle. I'm like pro-Biden, like, you know, I'm as boring as that. And I find, I'm sure that that's also age-related, that I see that, yeah, that I'm very comfortable in a much more compromising, ready to compromise world where I think we get along. But I think that I'm sure that has something to do with age also. Yeah.
That's so fascinating as a way to end, Stefan, because you've been so frequently called the enfant terrible of graphic design, and your early work was so confrontational, as I said, so raw, that kind of energy. And so to hear that from you now, particularly at a time of such turbulence and general uproar, I find extremely reassuring, I have to say.
I also think that I find these incredible divisions not productive. Yeah, I don't think it's a smart move going forward.
Yeah. Well, I hope a lot of people listen to this talk all the way to the end so they can hear you say that. And I'm sure they will, because it's been fantastic, every minute of it. Really, really appreciate the time that you spent with us, Stefan.
Glenn, it was a pleasure. Absolutely.
Briefly announced that this Friday, my co-host Stephen Burks will be back with Washington Fajardo, the Rio-based Brazilian urbanist and architect. So please come back on Friday to hear from Stephen and Washington Fajardo. And Stefan, thanks again for joining us on Design and Dialogue. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Okay,
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you.